Professor Allison, how are you? You here?
Good, thank you. Hello, Sana.
Hey, Professor Allison, so the mystery photo paper is due today, I believe.
Is it Thursday?
Okay, well, I'm working on it right now. So do you want us to write the summary in blog?
Yes.
Okay, so you just want to know what we found on that photo, because I found a lot of cool things. It's actually been really interesting researching it.
What you found? 1 second.
And also, what was what I wanted to ask you about? Yeah, I emailed you about Henry Lee, and then that monument one, I did not send you something that was due. I was looking at the syllabus about did you want us to send you something about what we found out about the monuments?
Yes. Yes. So
Okay.
on the photo assignment, it's what you found plus how you found it.
So I'll send that. I'll work on that as soon as this class is over. Also the camera thing, so you want us to go to the Boston Library to go get that camera? Because
No,
I work a lot.
I have the cameras.
Oh, okay.
And when you want one, you come and see me.
Professor Austin, I work so much. I'm like I literally let a customer go yesterday on a $50 transaction because I've been with school and work and inventory. It's crazy. So I'll probably just come to class on Thursday and pick that up for me then.
Okay. Very
Okay.
good. So for the camera, if you need the camera, come and see me and I will give you one. Okay. Good. So let us see where we are. Okay, so what I will talk about today is how Boston changes in the 19th century. Let me just see if I can share this easily. Okay, the big thing that happens in Boston in the 19th century is the Industrial Revolution. Boston really is the center for the American Industrial Revolution. And it starts with this man, John Cabot Lowell. Goes off to England in 1811, and he has a really good mind for how machinery works. And what he sees in England is the factories in Manchester, Birmingham, that have made England the world's leading industrial power. The factories that are producing cotton and wool textiles that the British then can sell to the rest of the world. And Lowell comes back to America, actually during the War of 1812, and sees that on the banks of the Charles River in Waltham, you have water power, and you can take that water power and build a factory which has the entire processes of turning raw wool into cloth under one roof. In England, the factory system was somewhat dispersed. That is, there would be one factory where they would clean the wool and card the wool, another one where they'd turn it into yarn, and another one where they would then spin the yarn or weave the yarn into cloth, and then another one where they would dye the cloth. And what the real innovation is that Lowell and his associates are able to do in Waltham is have all of that done in the same building. So the raw wool comes into the building, it's hoisted into the top floors where it is then carded. And this is the process you use to take wool Do you know where wool comes from? Sheep, yes. So, and usually once a year, the sheep can be sheared. And the way this economy worked traditionally was just about every woman would have a spinning wheel and use the spinning wheel to make yarn. And then take that yarn, and maybe there would be one woman in the town or two who might have a loom. And they would then turn this yarn into woven cloth on a loom. And it was kind of a barter economy. That is, you're producing yarn, which is something you can then sell or trade for something else. And because you have sheep and sheep produce wool, and then you are taking, you are part of this process, but it's not your full-time occupation. That is, you and women were the ones who would do the spinning, and typically also might do the sheep shearing, and women also would do the weaving. And there is in New England at this time, and it's the only part of the country where this is true, there are more women than men. And this is kind of one of the off-season things you would do on a farm. You can even do it in town, spinning, because you're producing something then that can be sold and earn money. Okay, so the thing about the Waltham factory is everything happens under one roof. And the labor force is almost entirely female. That is, women from the farms who will come and work in the factory and earn money, and then makes so they don't have to go back to the farm. That is, they're earning cash, and or they might marry someone from the town. So you're having a beginning of a change in the New England economy. The problem with Waltham was it wasn't, the Charles River didn't produce enough water power. But north of Boston, the Merrimack River has one of the steepest drops of any river on the East Coast. Over the course of about a mile or so, it drops several hundred feet. It's not a waterfall, but it's a series of rapids in what was then the town of Chelmsford. And these guys who had built the factory in Waltham in 1815 realized this. They buy up land in Chelmsford on the river, and then they build a factory town, which they name Lowell, as our friend Lowell had died. And these guys build this factory town in Lowell along the Merrimack River. And it is the first of what will be many of these mill towns along the rivers of New England that are going to turn New England into the most industrialized area in North America. In fact, by the 1840s, the Merrimack River will be the most industrialized place in the Western Hemisphere. And it is a center for these factories that are taking wool from the farms of New England, turning it into cloth, and then later taking cotton from the American South and turning it into cloth. In Lawrence becomes more of a cotton producing town. And back in the 1790s, the Middlesex Canal had been created, connecting the Merrimack River, actually connecting the Merrimack River right at Lowell, what then was Chelmsford, with Boston. So everything going up to Lowell came by way of Boston and vice versa. The real capital behind the building of the mills was here in Boston, and it remains so. Okay, so you have Boston in the 19th century becoming the center of the American Industrial Revolution. And the capital produced by the Industrial Revolution comes by way of Boston, leaves by way of Boston. So the Industrial Revolution is all in all a good thing for Boston. Okay, so this is one of the big changes happening after the War of 1812, the industrialization of New England. So big change, industrialization of New England, really in the beginning years and middle years of the 19th century. And it's also in this time that Boston becomes a city. Boston had been a town, that is, it had a town meeting like other New England towns. And so the change in the 1820s is when Boston adopts a city government. That's why it's a trick question. Founding of Boston, 1630 is the year the town was founded. 1822 is when Boston became a city. And the first mayor of Boston was Jonathan Phillips, who died in office, and he was succeeded by Josiah Quincy. And Quincy is still called the Great Mayor. He served 6 one-year terms as mayor of Boston, and during his tenure as mayor, the Boston built the Quincy Marketplace and also built a house of correction and a house of industry in South Boston. And Quincy was responsible for cleaning up the downtown area. He personally wrote traffic citations for people who double parked their carriages. He did other things, very high profile mayor. And then he was voted out of office and became president of Harvard. And so Josiah Quincy is the only mayor of Boston also to be president of Harvard. I'm pretty certain he will always be the only mayor of Boston also to serve as president of Harvard, but I've been wrong about other things. So Quincy serves as mayor, for the second mayor of Boston. It's also in this period, you have the building of the Mass General Hospital, the building you see on the left, and Quincy Marketplace, the expansion of Boston, and also in the 1830s, the building of the Public Garden, the area along the mudflats just to the west of downtown, and also the laying out of the streets in South Boston, which had been annexed in 1804. And also the big thing happening was the building of the Bunker Hill Monument in Charlestown. Now, this is a couple of other things happening in Boston in this period worth noting. One is Boston always had had a small but significant African-American population. And in the 1600s, Massachusetts was the first mainland colony to legalize the institution of slavery. And the first Africans had arrived in the 1630s and had been enslaved. And in the early 1640s, the Puritans had codified the status of enslaved people, making Massachusetts the first state to have the status of slavery in British North America. Then in the 1780s, Massachusetts becomes the first American state to abolish slavery. And that was a court case, a couple of court cases in the 1780s that abolished slavery. So there is a free African-American population, mainly on the north slope of Beacon Hill. In 1806, the Black community had built the African Meeting House on Joy Street. And in the 1820s, had built the Abiel Smith School next to it, the oldest school in the country built for the education of Black students. And also in the 1820s, David Walker had moved to Boston. He was born free in North Carolina. In the early 1820s, had become involved with a major slave uprising in South Carolina. He had managed to flee from South Carolina and is in Boston, where he has a job, actually a shop, that sells used clothing or ready-made clothing to Southern planters. That is, remember, we have a huge textile industry growing here in Boston. And we have the business of making ready-made clothing, and Walker would sell clothing in bulk to the southern states, where barrels of clothing would be shipped. And every year, traditionally at Christmas, a slave owner would provide a new suit of clothes to all of his enslaved people. And so these barrels of clothing are being shipped to South Carolina, and included in the shipment, Walker would put copies of this pamphlet, David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And David Walker's Appeal is an incendiary anti-slavery pamphlet. It's calling on the enslaved people to rise up and overthrow their owners, kill their owners, and become free. Now, if you were enslaved, you probably don't need to read a book by David Walker to let you know slavery is not a good thing. But what this is doing is showing that there are people who agree with you and that will support you if you rise up against your oppressors. And what happens is the governor of South Carolina and the mayor of Charleston and the governor of Georgia write to the mayor of Boston saying, you should arrest this guy because he's going to stir up a rebellion against us. The mayor of Boston at this time was Harrison Gray Otis. And Otis, you know, this is the big issue of slavery, which is confronting South Carolina, also is confronting Boston. And the choice for Otis is, does he arrest Walker, prevent him from publishing his pamphlet, the risk of stirring up an insurrection in South Carolina? And Otis is not an abolitionist, but he also is a believer in free speech. So he does not arrest David Walker, whose pamphlet continues to circulate till Walker dies somewhat mysteriously in 1831. There's some suspicion he might have been poisoned. So you have the industrialization of Boston and the presence of a free Black community really challenging the institution of slavery. At the same time, Boston's position really derives from its position in the textile industry, which is becoming more and more dependent on cotton from the southern states, as opposed to wool from the New England states. Okay, so this is Boston in the 1820s, this kind of urbanization, and another real tension here in Boston in this period involves immigration. And back in 1809, Boston had become a diocese, a Catholic diocese. And there had been there was a growing number of Catholics in Boston. And remember, Boston had been vehemently anti-Catholic from the very beginning. You may recall the Pope's Day riots every year on the 5th of November, and Boston being so vehemently Protestant and anti, as it would have been called, papist. But you do have, with the development of industry and an influx of Irish immigrants, mainly to work as industrial workers or to build the railroads or dig the canals, do the kind of heavy manual labor that this emerging industrial infrastructure required. And this causes a certain upset in the civic life of Boston. Also, the first bishop of Boston had been Jean Cheverus. And Cheverus was French and was a French, well, he's a very amiable guy, and also recognized how deeply suspicious Bostonians were of Catholics. And he really managed to cultivate a very good relationship with the elite of Boston. And Cheverus winds up after the restoration of the French monarchy in the 18 teens, going back to France, where he becomes the Cardinal of Bordeaux. He's misses Boston, very much at home in Boston, and in Boston, even though he is a Catholic priest, he can function very well with the New England aristocracy. That is, he raises money to build the cathedral from leaders of the New England establishment. And he's one of the first proprietors of the Boston Athenaeum. And he is very much a gentleman and knows how to get along. His successor as Archbishop is Benedict Fenwick. And Bishop Fenwick is American. And if you're an American, you should probably, well, if you're not, you should probably be aware of the fact Americans typically don't apologize for who they are. And Americans take it as kind of an insult if anyone questions what they're doing. And Fenwick was a Catholic from Maryland, very much an American, and he thinks the Bostonians should get over themselves. If they have prejudices against the Catholics, that's really their problem and not his. And it's probably a characteristically American attitude, but it's not one calculated to win friends in a place that might be hostile to people who profess his faith. Now, there is also in Boston, as I said, kind of an anti-Catholic strain. I'm trying to put this in a way that it will make sense. Does any of this make sense to you, what I am saying? I only have poor Ahad and Amber here to try to make sense of all of this. So, now, with a rising number of immigrants, there is also kind of a rising challenge to the idea of the efficacy of allowing immigrants in. And one of the most influential American ministers of the 19th century, or of all time, is this man, Lyman Beecher. And the Reverend Beecher was a congregational minister, originally from Connecticut, great evangelist. And Reverend Beecher had come to Boston in the 1820s to become the minister here at the Bowdoin Street Church, and really called here by a congregation which wanted a better minister to preach not against the problem of Catholics, but against the problem of Unitarians. This is getting even more confusing, and I apologize. Unitarianism is a religious denomination that grew out of Congregationalism. The Congregationalists were the initial religious group here, the European religious group here. And at the time, around the time of the Revolution, there had been a movement among Congregationalists toward Unitarianism. And we don't need to get into the theology of Unitarianism. Instead of believing in the Trinity, they believe in one God. The more important thing is the Congregationalists tended to worship the God of the Old Testament, the God who knew you had sinned, and you knew you had sinned, and your job was to get right with God and stop sinning. The Unitarians, is anyone here a Unitarian? Anyone at home a Unitarian?
No.
Okay. Their God realizes how hard you're trying and knows you really do want to do the right thing, but it's always difficult to know what the right thing is. And their God is the forgiving God who wants you to do better because you want to do better. And this doctrine has a certain appeal, particularly among the more sophisticated folks in Boston who are tired of that Old Testament God who's always telling them what they were doing was wrong. I suppose if you had someone always telling you you were wrong and you were certain you were always wrong, you either might try to do better or you may get tired of that and find another God, which is what seemed to be happening with the Unitarians. And the Unitarians really were Lyman Beecher's chief target. Unitarians as well as temperance. He was one of the great first advocates of the temperance movement. Just as a point of interest, the average American over the age of 15 in this period would every year consume 7 gallons of alcohol, mainly cider or whiskey. And so alcohol, drunkenness is actually a big problem, and it's one of the problems that Lyman Beecher attacked. He comes to Boston really to rail about the Unitarians who have this misguided sense of God's judgment, and he's very effective at this. But he also will have things to say about the papist menace. Now, Beecher, by the way, he has a number of children who go on to have be people of great accomplishment. His daughter, Harriet, in the early 1830s, Lyman Beecher goes out to Ohio and becomes the president of a theology seminary in Cincinnati. And there his daughter, Harriet, marries one of his students, a minister named Stowe, and she goes on to write the great anti-slavery book. And then his daughter, Catherine, writes a book about home economics. And then his son, Henry Ward Beecher, later in the century becomes the leading American theologian of the late 19th century. So Lyman Beecher, tremendous preacher and tremendous influence. And in the early 1830s, he gives a series of very fiery sermons, not about the Unitarians or about temperance, but about the papist menace. That is the threat to American institutions being brought by the Catholic Church. And at about this same time, a young woman named Rebecca Reed, who had been a teacher at a convent school in what is now Somerville, writes her expose, 6 months in a convent, about what happens inside the Mount Benedict School in Charlestown. Now, the Mount Benedict School is on Mount Benedict in Charlestown. It was a school started by the Ursuline sisters, a French religious order, and they had been invited to come and start this school by Bishop Fenwick. Now, it's a boarding school for young women in Boston. Very few of the students at this school were Catholic. Most were Unitarian. That is, if you are a prosperous Unitarian family in Boston, you might want to send your daughter to a better school than the public schools. Boston does have public schools, and the public schools are very much centered on, the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And you won't learn things like foreign languages or music or art, which you could learn in the convent school. That is, the Ursuline sisters taught French and music and other things. And so children or daughters of Boston's elite were being sent to the Ursuline convent school to get a better education than was available in the schools, in the public schools in Boston, which tended to be mainly congregational. You can kind of see a potential for class grievance here as how come these children of Boston's elite are going to a school staffed by Catholic nuns where perhaps they are being encouraged to become nuns themselves. What's wrong with the public schools, which are good enough for us? And so you can kind of see this class tension building in the early 1830s with the convent school opening. And by the way, at the same time that the school is opening, Bishop Fenwick has purchased land on Bunker Hill in Charlestown, where he wants to build a Catholic church. And Charlestown is still a separate town at this time, separate from Boston. And so the Ursuline Convent is in Charlestown, Bunker Hill is in Charlestown, and Bishop Fenwick, in fact, in the summer of 1834, is engaged in a fight with the Board of Selectmen in Charlestown because they don't want him to build a church on Bunker Hill. They also don't want him to have a cemetery on Bunker Hill. And during that summer, he had the unfortunate death of a couple of Catholic children whom he wants to bury on Bunker Hill. The selectmen in Charlestown forbid him permission to bury Catholic children who are dead on Bunker Hill. They say it will threaten the public health of the people of Charlestown. When he points out there is a Protestant cemetery on Bunker Hill, they say that's beside the point, that they don't want a Catholic cemetery on Bunker Hill. So he's engaged in a legal fight with the selectmen of Charlestown over burials on Bunker Hill at the same time as you have this growing grievance about children of the Unitarian elite being sent to be educated by the Ursuline nuns. And then you have Rebecca Reed writing her expose, 6 months in a convent, which tells us what happens to a young woman who spends 6 months in a convent in Charlestown. And Beecher had gone out, as I said, to Cincinnati, comes back and gives a series of these fiery sermons about the Catholic menace here at Park Street Church, which was known as Brimstone Corner because of his fiery anti-Catholic sermons and so on being preached at the Park Street Church. And at about the same time, in addition to Rebecca Reed's 6 months in a convent, this book is published. And this is one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. In fact, before Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her book, this was the best-selling American book of the 19th century, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. And Maria Monk, according to her story, was a Protestant girl who had been kidnapped, taken to a convent up in Montreal, where she was forced to convert to Catholicism, and also as a nun became, it's a licentious book, The Sex Slaves of the Catholic Priests. And if anyone has never been inside a convent, this tells you what goes on inside convents, and it's quite salacious. It turns out Maria Monk had not, in fact, been impregnated by a Catholic priest, as her book says, and she makes up a lot of this. But it's enough to inflame the public consciousness. And in the summer of 1834, in the wake of Lyman Beecher's sermons and Bishop Fenwick's fight with the Charlestown selectmen, a mob from Boston goes over to Charlestown and burns down the Ursuline convent. The Mother Superior tells this mob that has appeared that there are 20,000 Irishmen in the railroad camps nearby who will come and deal with them if they don't get off of the property of the nunnery of the convent. It's probably, she thought it was an effective means of argument. It turns out not to dissuade the mob from burning down the convent, and the sisters and all of the students managed to get out. And after this, after the attack on the convent and the burning of the convent, the better sort of people in Boston are quite appalled at this. They want to, actually a number of people are indicted for arson, but are all acquitted. You're not going to find a jury in Boston or in Charlestown that is going to convict people for burning down a Catholic convent. And it's an embarrassing thing for Boston, the burning of the convent, and the nuns do wind up rebuilding in West Roxbury, and Bishop Fenwick leaves the burned convent on Mount Benedict as kind of a symbol to everyone. They can see what they've done. Now, he's not someone easily cowed by mobs, nor is the Mother Superior. So you have the burning of the convent, which forces some Bostonians to say, you know, do we really want mobs burning down convent schools if they don't like what's going on? Now, at the same time, or 2 years later, I should say, in 1837, you have another of these episodes of anti-Catholic violence when this is Fort Hill in Boston, an area roughly where the financial district is now. And this had been a relatively, well, it had been an upscale area. And then with the building of Beacon Hill, the wealthier people had moved out to Beacon Hill, and their houses had been chopped up into smaller rooms, and being near the docks, this becomes one of the most densely populated slums in the United States, the area of Fort Hill, very crowded area, close to the docks. So Irish immigrants, their first place they would find to stay would be here in this very crowded area of Fort Hill. So heavily populated Irish slum. And working on the docks is still one of the easiest kinds of jobs to get, requiring manual labor and densely populated. And what happens here is this. In the summer of 1837, an Irish funeral is making its way to the St. Vincent de Paul Chapel in the financial district. And there is a fire company coming back from putting out a fire. And the funeral and the fire companies at this time were social clubs. Boston did not have a professional firefighting force. So you and your friends would form a fire company, and then when there was a fire, you would race to it to try to put out the fire. As if you beat out other groups to put out the fire, you would get paid for putting out the fire. So being a firefighter was kind of a social thing. Yes, you did have to go and put out fires, but it's also a social gathering. And in this case, the firefighters coming back from putting out a fire think that the funeral procession should get out of their way, because after all, they had been putting out a fire. By the way, who should defer to whom when there's a dispute between a fire company and a funeral? I'm guessing no one here has been a firefighter. Firefighters actually do have the right of way. However, if you've ever been in a funeral, you probably feel that you have the right of way. And in this case, what happens is, since you have two groups, primarily young men, each one thinking it was right, what happens is they start fighting. And the fire companies were entirely Protestant. Of course, the Catholic funeral is entirely Catholic. And what you have beginning with this fight on Broad Street is a riot that goes on for the next 3 days between Protestant firefighters and others. The militia is called out, and these mainly male Irish immigrants. So 3 days of rioting on Fort Hill, precipitated by harsh words spoken between people going to a funeral and firefighters. And again, number of indictments are brought against people for being part of this riot. None of the anti-Catholic rioters is going to be convicted of rioting. But what does happen in the wake of this is the city government decides to clamp down on the firefighters. And this is why Boston has a professional firefighting force, because of this reform that happens after the Broad Street riot. Okay. Now, this is kind of one side of Boston, the tough working class city anti-Catholic, and you also have a more high-toned Boston, which is caught up in this age of reform. And here are a couple of notable reformers in Boston. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody is the woman here. This is a portrait of her taken later in life. Never had her portrait done when she was younger because she was much busy about other things. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody had come to Boston early in the 1800s to teach school. Her father was a dentist up in the North Shore, and apparently not a very good dentist. Consequently, Elizabeth had to go to work to help support the family, including her mother and her younger sisters. And so she teaches school in Boston. And not only does she teach school, she thinks about education. She is responsible for bringing to the United States an idea for early childhood education, which we call kindergarten, from the German word. And she also, while she is in Boston, she becomes a disciple of William Ellery Channing. And Channing, it's unfair that I've spoken so much about Lyman Beecher and Lyman Beecher's disdain for Unitarians. William Ellery Channing is a Unitarian minister, but he's more than that. He is a minister who is reshaping Christianity. And his sermons are brilliant expositions of Christian doctrine, making it applicable to the world in the 19th century. And Elizabeth Palmer Peabody comes to Boston, never misses one of his sermons, and in fact, she takes notes and she learns how to print and sets up a printing press on West Street, which is not far from where we are now, which she calls the Dial Press. And the Dial Press specializes in books like Channing's, which are recasting Christianity with this idea that we as ordinary mortals should be able to transcend this veil of tears and seek for a connection with God, not through the ministrations of Lyman Beecher, or even, for that matter, Benedict Fenwick, but through a direct connection with the eternal. It's a new kind of philosophy emerging in New England, which is called transcendentalism. And she, by the way, when she had been teaching school, her co-teacher was another expositor of this idea named Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so the Dial Press also prints Emerson's essays and other works that become known as the part of the transcendentalist movement, an intellectual philosophy of the early 19th century. So Elizabeth Palmer Peabody is helping to create transcendentalism in Boston, in this really complicated, messy Boston of the 1820s and 1830s. Now, while she is working at the Dial Press and thinking about transcendentalism, she is staying at a boarding house on Ashburton Place. If you look at the side of the Sawyer building, you'll see the shadow of a building that was once there. And that would have been the boarding house where Elizabeth Palmer Peabody stayed. Young people at this time, when they came to Boston, wouldn't be renting an apartment or a dorm room. They would stay in a boarding house. and everyone would typically eat at the same table, and then you would have your own separate room. But it was a way of particularly young people who were working at something would live in a boarding house, pay room and board, and then have these communal meals. And so while she is staying in the boarding house, one of the other people staying in the boarding house was Horace Mann. And Mann was at this time actually a member of the Massachusetts State Senate. And he was a lawyer. He was from the town of Franklin in southeastern Massachusetts. Franklin had been named for Benjamin Franklin. Back in the 1770s, this town, and it was part of another town. And they wanted to become an independent town, and they also wanted a new bell for the meeting house. So they thought a good way to get a bell for the meeting house would be to write to someone who might be in a position to buy them a bell and say, if you buy us a bell, we'll name the town for you. Does anyone know who they wrote to? Well, they wrote to Benjamin Franklin, who at this time was the American minister to France, an eminent American, and of course, a bell for the meeting house would be well within Franklin's gift. And they said, we'll name the town for you if you send us a bell for our meeting house. Now, Franklin, I'm not quite sure if he was as susceptible to flattery as they thought. He said, I think you need sense more than you need sound. So instead of sending them a bell, he sent them the value of a bell in books so that they could create a library. I suspect they weren't as pleased with this gift of books as they might have been, because though they did name the town Franklin, they kept the books mainly in the chair of the Board of Selectmen's house. And people who wanted to look at the books could come and look at them, but they really were somewhat grudging about creating a library. They do now boast having a library, and the books are still there now in the public library, but it took them a while to get over not getting a bell for the town, even though they went to the trouble of naming the town for Benjamin Franklin. Now, one of the people who made use of these books was Horace Mann. Mann grew up on a farm outside Franklin, did not have a lot of money as a boy, and the family didn't really think an education would be such a valuable thing for someone who's going to be working on a farm. But Mann was curious, and as a young boy and a young man, he did make use of these books in the Board of Selectmen chair's house, which were the bequest of Benjamin Franklin. And when he was in his 20s, after he had already started working on the farm, he was able to enroll in Brown University in Providence. And so he graduates from college, and then he becomes a lawyer, marries, and is elected to the Massachusetts State House of Representatives, and then the Massachusetts State Senate. His wife dies. He's now living in a boarding house where he's as a member of the State Senate, and he meets Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And Mann also is interested in education, as is Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And not just the rote education as it was being practiced in American schools. The fact that so many Boston families are sending their children to a convent school is an indication that the public schools aren't all they should be. And Mann and Elizabeth Palmer Peabody are also interested in other things that we can do as individuals, or if we happen to be members of the state legislature, to improve the lives of those who live here. So Mann and Elizabeth Palmer Peabody have a great partnership during these years in the boarding house as they're discussing ways of improving society. It seems like a match made in heaven. And there's some suspicion that perhaps Elizabeth Palmer Peabody might have become Mrs. Horace Mann. However, before that happens, Elizabeth's younger sister, Mary, comes to town, and she meets Horace Mann, and Horace Mann and Mary Peabody are married at the Dial printing office. Again, a sign of this, that they don't get married in a church, but at the printing office, which is the intellectual center of the transcendental movement. And Horace Mann goes on to become really the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, responsible for creating common schools, public schools, as well as teacher colleges in Massachusetts. The normal schools created in Lexington, Fitchburg, and so on by Horace Mann are part of this effort, the schools that are now part of the Massachusetts State College system. That is Fitchburg State, Framingham State, Salem State, 4 Cs, all at one time were schools created by Mann to train teachers, and primarily schools for women, colleges for women. Okay, now Elizabeth Palmer Peabody still and will continue to have a great intellectual connection with other people. And after Horace Mann marries her sister, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody does become a mentor to a young man from Salem. And the young man from Salem is determined to be an American writer. Not just someone who makes a living from writing, but someone who is a literary artist, someone who really cares about writing as an art. And this young man is also purported to be, in addition to being a gifted writer, is also purported to be the most handsome man in Salem. And I'm sorry I didn't bring in a picture of him to show you. His name was Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Elizabeth Palmer Peabody was helping Nathaniel Hawthorne find his literary voice, which he would use to reshape American literature. And there is some speculation that perhaps Elizabeth Palmer Peabody might have become Mrs. Nathaniel Hawthorne, yet another of these matches that seemed destined, but then she introduced him to her other sister. And her other sister, Sophia, was an artist. And Sophia had been sickly as a girl, and no one thought she would live to adulthood, but she did. And she met Nathaniel Hawthorne, and she and Nathaniel Hawthorne marry and enjoy a happy life together. And with this, though Elizabeth Palmer Peabody runs out of sisters, she doesn't run out of ideas of ways to improve the world. So I don't know why I spent so much time on her story, which always ends with one of her sisters marrying someone whom she might have had her eye. She never marries, but lives a happy life, helping us to improve our lives. And in the 1840s, one of the big events in Boston in the 1840s was the arrival in Boston of this man, Charles Dickens. And Dickens, by the way, I mentioned the Dial Press here, but Boston is also a center for the American publishing trade. And one of the big publishers in America is Ticknor and Fields. And Ticknor and Fields publish Longfellow and Hawthorne and also Charles Dickens, who is the best-selling English writer of the 19th century, and famous for Oliver Twist and David Copperfield and other books. And his arrival in Boston was a big event on his American tour. He'll stay at the Parker House, and if you go into the Parker House, you can see the mirror where Dickens practiced for his performances. He would do readings, which were more reenactments and recreations of stories from his book, or from his books. He was on a lecture tour. And by the way, his books often were published in serial form in a magazine, and people would line the docks waiting for the latest issue of the Century magazine or whatever was publishing Dickens to find out what had happened in the next installment. So his arrival is a big thing. But when he comes to Boston, he is really not here to meet with the other leading literary lights of the town. He wants to see the mills in Lowell because he is writing about the barbaric conditions in the mills of England. And in the mills in Lowell, he is seeing a much different world. You have all of these young women working in the mills, but they are not thoroughly degraded by the capitalist system. In fact, the women in the mills are producing, I thought I had more on the women in the mills and what they were producing. They're producing literary magazines, other things, much different world. And the person in Boston he most wants to meet is Laura Bridgman. And Laura Bridgman was now a young woman Laura Bridgman was born in New Hampshire, and when she was 2 years old, she was stricken with scarlet fever that left her both deaf and blind, which meant that in order to prevent her from falling into the fire, because she would have no way of knowing that the fire was there and was dangerous, the family had to keep her tied to a chair. And unable to see, she couldn't see the fire, unable to hear, she couldn't hear words. So she never learned how to communicate with anyone else. So she was destined to a life essentially tied to a chair for her own safety. When she was 7 years old, she was brought to Boston to the Perkins School for the Blind. This was an institution started in the South End, actually in the Fort Hill area, in a former mansion that belonged to Thomas Handseed Perkins. Thomas Handseed Perkins had made his fortune in the China trade, and he is convinced by Samuel Gridley Howe, this man with the beard is Samuel Gridley Howe. Howe was an enterprising young man thinking about the future and the way the world should operate. And he had gone off to Greece during the Greek War for Independence against the Turks and had come back, and he settles on this idea of starting a school for the blind. This is really at the dawn of education of the blind and ideas about the blind. I should have mentioned that Horace Mann was really interested in treatment of the mentally ill. That is, how can we have problems like this, and how can we overcome problems like this? And Samuel Gridley Howe is thinking about solutions to this problem of people who are blind. We know that they can still function in society. And at this time, Louis Braille had developed a way of raising letters so that blind people can learn how to read. And the Perkins School is teaching the blind. After a few years in the South End, it moves to a former luxury hotel in South Boston, the Mount Washington House. And it had been the Mount Washington Hotel. And with the generosity of Thomas Handseed Perkins, Howe is able to buy the Mount Washington Hotel, and it becomes the Perkins School. And then in the early 1740s, he hears about this girl in New Hampshire who is not only blind, but also deaf. And Howe wants to bring her to the Perkins School so that she can learn how to communicate. By the way, this is something that in the history of the human race, no person had ever done. No deaf-blind child who had not already learned speech or language had ever been able to learn these abstract things. But Howe brings Laura Bridgman to the Perkins School in South Boston, where the teachers are able to convey to her that abstract symbols will have a meaning for something concrete. And with this, she is then able to communicate, that is, to develop the same language they do. So she is, in the history of the human race, the first deaf-blind person able to break through the darkness and the silence and communicate with a wider world. And Charles Dickens can't wait to meet this woman, because she is a phenomenon. I should say she is less impressed with Dickens than he is with her. She could feel someone's hand and know who the person was if she'd only met them once. She has a great sensitivity for that. And also she is, as you can probably imagine, a great asset to the Perkins School, which has accomplished something no one else in the history of the world has ever done. And Laura Bridgman will go on to live at the Perkins School for the rest of her life. And when she's there in the 1880s, or 1870s, as an older woman, a family, actually, a young girl from Boston, daughter of Irish immigrants, is temporarily left blind by yellow fever or scarlet fever. Her father brings her to the Perkins School, and because she is Irish, the Protestant blind children want nothing to do with her. The one person in the school who befriends her is Laura Bridgman, now a middle-aged woman who is both deaf and blind. And Laura Bridgman becomes a friend to young Anne Sullivan, who is an Irish girl from Boston who is temporarily blind. Her eyesight always will be faulty throughout her life. And then Anne Sullivan grows up to become a teacher at the Perkins School. And in the 1880s, a family in Alabama whose daughter is deaf and blind know about Laura Bridgman, know about the Perkins School, and bring their daughter to Boston until Helen Keller becomes Anne Sullivan's pupil. So here you have Laura Bridgman, deaf, blind young woman from New Hampshire, one generation separated from Helen Keller, who becomes, in the 20th century, a deaf-blind graduate of Radcliffe. So Dickens, as I said, more impressed with Laura Bridgman than she is with him. This is at a time of tremendous anti-Irish bigotry. I don't want to dwell on it, but it's part of the intellectual culture of Boston. As Boston is drawing immigrants, not because of the high culture of the Ticknor and Fields, but because of the mills and because of the other heavy industry. South Boston is a center for the building of iron ships, and Cyrus Alger is a builder of, has actually the largest ironworks in the country. And in the 1850s, Boston becomes a center for the anti-slavery movement. By the way, are there any questions? I realize I'm just talking a lot and not giving anyone else a chance to say anything, which might be what you had been banking on.
No.
Okay. So there is, Boston becomes, I mentioned David Walker. Also in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison begins publishing The Liberator in Boston. And Boston is the home of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, presided over by William Lloyd Garrison. And this is probably the most important of the reform movements of the 19th century, but it's not a popular one. Now, Garrison argued that the Constitution was a covenant with death. And he burned a copy of the Constitution on the street and said there should be no union with slaveholders. And this provokes a riot from Bostonians who didn't think that the Constitution was a covenant with death, and also recognized that New England's economy depended on a supply of cheap cotton from the slave states. And in fact, the leading political movement in Boston, or in Massachusetts, the Whig Party, had a lot of the textile magnates, that is, the people who own the textile mills, are the Whigs. And they don't see disrupting the cotton trade as in the long-term best interests of New England's economy. And this emanates in a number of ways. The two people you see on the screen right now, one of them is Lemuel Shaw, who is the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And in the 1840s, a case comes before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court involving a young girl named Sarah Roberts. I mentioned the Abiel Smith School on Joy Street on Beacon Hill, and this was the only school in Boston that would admit Black children. And Sarah Roberts had to walk past 5 other schools that were closer to her home before she could get to the Abiel Smith School, which was the only school she was allowed to attend because she was Black. And her father sued, and the case was also argued by Robert Morris, who is the only African-American lawyer in Boston. He is assisted by Charles Sumner. And Chief Justice Shaw and the Supreme Judicial Court rule that Sarah Roberts does not have to be admitted to any other school, that it is permissible to have a separate school for children of one race. This is a doctrine, by the way, the city of Boston overturns this a few years later, creating or mandating equal education, equal access to education. However, the United States doesn't for another century. And the other character is Daniel Webster. And Webster was a senator from Massachusetts, Secretary of State, and in fact, in 1844, when the Bunker Hill Monument was dedicated, Webster gave the principal oration. He had given the principal oration in 1825, when the cornerstone was laid for the Bunker Hill Monument. You know, it took 18 years to build the Bunker Hill Monument, which is longer than it took to finish the Big Dig, or probably many other things. 18 years, probably, I don't know, does that seem like a long time to you, or not so long? It does seem like a long time to you. It's, you know, not that much. You've probably, have you been alive longer than 18 years? So it's, yeah, close, okay.
They're like so young, yeah.
So anyway, Webster was the principal speaker at the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument. John Quincy Adams refused to attend because Webster was going to be there, and Webster was also bringing the president. Webster at this time was Secretary of State, and the president was John Tyler, a slave owner from Virginia, and John Quincy Adams, who remembered the day of the Battle of Bunker Hill, wrote in his diary that the shadow of the president's nose will obscure the monument being raised on Breed's Hill. And Webster, in 1850, as part of a compromise measure, when the Union was threatened, supported the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed federal marshals to apprehend fugitives from slavery who made their way even to a free state. And in early 1851, Shadrach Minkins, who was a fugitive from slavery, was apprehended in Boston. And he was held at the courthouse on Court Street. And this man, Lewis Hayden, who's another used furniture dealer. Lewis Hayden was from Kentucky. He and his wife, Harriet, had escaped from slavery in Kentucky and now were living on Beacon Hill. And Lewis Hayden organized the Boston Vigilance Committee that would protect fugitives who were threatened with being apprehended under the Fugitive Slave Law. And here you see the courthouse on Court Street. And in 1854, they free Shadrach Minkins and spirit him off to Canada. Then in 1854, Anthony Burns was apprehended in Boston, another fugitive from slavery from Virginia. And this time the federal government wants to show that it can enforce the law, even a law that is unpopular in Boston. And so in 1854, the federal government sends out more troops to ensure that Anthony Burns will not be freed. And a riot ensues outside the courthouse in which a federal marshal is killed. And Burns, though, is returned to slavery in 1854. And this is one of the signal events in Boston. By this time, Daniel Webster is dead. And when his statue is put up in front of the State House, there is an outcry from opponents of the institution of slavery as to Webster being there for all his faults, as Anthony Burns returned to slavery in Virginia in an event that is going to help harden ideas about slavery in Boston and in the rest of the North. Why don't we call it a day at this point? I hate to end on a bad note with Anthony Burns being returned to slavery, but next time we'll see what happens with the Civil War. Any questions?
Nope. Thank you. I'm excited about the Civil War. I love it.
Well, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care. Good to see you.